The first warning sign appeared months before anyone noticed. No television debate. No viral headline. No explosive interview. Just a deadline. Missed. Then corrected. Then forgotten. Or so everyone thought. Here is what the public record actually shows. In 2021, the Archewell Foundation, the charitable organization founded by Prince Harry and Meghan Markle following their departure from the British royal family, was listed by the California Attorney General's Registry of Charitable Trusts as delinquent. Not investigated. Not accused of fraud. Delinquent. A technical, administrative classification that means an annual filing requirement had not been met on time. It was corrected. The filing was submitted. The status was resolved. And virtually every media outlet that mentioned it moved on within 48 hours. But here is what almost nobody asked. Inside the corrected filing, sitting in plain sight in the publicly available IRS Form 990, were numbers that told a different story than the one appearing in the press releases. Expense ratios that raised eyebrows among nonprofit analysts. A governance structure that an independent watchdog would later place on the public record as non-compliant with basic sector standards. Grant figures that moved in the wrong direction in the same year the foundation's public profile was expanding. These were not buried. They were not hidden. They were filed with the United States federal government and made available to anyone with an internet connection and enough patience to read a tax document. Almost nobody read them. At the time, almost nobody paid attention. But one compliance expert did. And what she found inside those pages, not inside a tip from a palace source, not inside a tabloid exclusive, but inside the foundation's own government filings, would eventually land in a watchdog report, cited by name, that asked a question the foundation has never cleanly answered. The correction solved the immediate problem, but it accidentally created a much bigger question. Stay with me. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update on this story as it develops. To understand why a missed filing matters, you have to understand how nonprofit compliance systems actually work in the United States. Every charitable organization registered in California, and Archewell Foundation is registered in California, is required to file an annual report with the state's Registry of Charitable Trusts. The form is called the RRF-1. It is not complicated. It is not obscure. It is a standard document that every legitimately operating nonprofit in the state knows about, prepares for, and submits on time year after year without incident. Failing to file on time carries a consequence. The registry marks the organization as delinquent. That classification is visible to the public. It sits on the registry's searchable database. And once it appears, it does something specific to donor confidence. It creates a question mark. Not proof of wrongdoing, a question mark. When Archewell Foundation appeared on that delinquent list in 2021, the public reaction was largely split between two camps. Supporters of Harry and Meghan pointed out, correctly, that the delinquency was administrative, not criminal. Critics pointed out, also correctly, that an organization with the resources and public profile of Archewell had no reasonable excuse for missing a standard annual filing. Both camps were arguing about the wrong thing. What the compliance community noticed was quieter. A $200 annual renewal fee had gone unpaid. The California Attorney General's office had formally ordered the foundation to stop soliciting charitable donations until the issue was resolved. That order was brief. The situation was corrected. But a question lingered in rooms the mainstream media never entered. How does an organization with millions in resources and a full staff miss a $200 fee? The answer most people settled on was administrative oversight. A busy team. A transitional year. The kind of paperwork slip that happens to organizations large and small. That explanation is plausible. It is also incomplete. Because when the filing was corrected and the full Form 990 became available to analysts and watchdogs who knew how to read one, the compliance question faded from the headlines almost immediately. And a different set of numbers quietly entered the record. The correction solved the immediate problem, but it accidentally created a much bigger question. Because once reporters started comparing timelines, the foundation's public-facing growth narrative against its own documented financial figures, something didn't quite fit. Journalists who cover nonprofits for a living have a particular skill. They read documents the way a doctor reads a chart, not looking for a single dramatic symptom, but looking for patterns across multiple data points that, taken together, tell a story the summary doesn't. When nonprofit reporters began examining Archewell's publicly filed Form 990s across multiple years, the pattern they found was not what the Foundation's public communications were suggesting. The Foundation's press releases described an organization on the move, new programming, new partnerships, new platforms for impact. The language was expansive. The mission statements were ambitious. The photographs at Foundation events showed a couple deeply engaged in the work of institutional giving. The 990 filings told a more complicated story. In 2022, Archewell Foundation reported that its governing board consisted of 2 voting members, Harry and Meghan themselves. The widely accepted minimum standard in the nonprofit sector, endorsed by virtually every major governance body, including the National Council of Nonprofits, is 5 independent board members, the majority of whom should have no financial relationship with the organization's founders. Archewell had 2, both of them founders, both of them married to each other. Lori Styron, the CEO of Charity Watch, an independent nonprofit watchdog organization, placed this fact on the public record. Her specific assessment: a charity whose board is too small and lacks a majority of independent members is not well positioned to consistently make decisions that are in the best interest of the charity or to provide adequate oversight of its operations. That is not an allegation. That is a governance standard applied to a publicly available document. Different outlets reported this finding differently. Some treated it as a serious institutional concern. Others framed it as an attack on a couple they believed was being unfairly targeted. The Foundation's communications team pushed back, emphasizing the organization's stated commitment to doing good. The governance concern didn't go away. It sat in the filing. Then another document surfaced. Charity Watch attempted to apply its standard rating methodology to the Archewell Foundation, the same methodology applied to thousands of charitable organizations across the country. The rating involves reviewing expense ratios, board structure, transparency documentation, and financial reporting consistency. Archewell could not be rated, not because it had failed spectacularly, because it lacked the independent governance structure and financial transparency that Charity Watch's rating system requires as a baseline condition. An organization that cannot be rated by the sector's own watchdog standards is not necessarily a bad organization, but it is one that has structured itself in a way that makes independent external evaluation impossible. And that document raised a question nobody had been asking. Not, is this organization committing fraud? But, if this organization is doing everything right, why has it structured itself in a way that makes that impossible to verify? Something shifts in the life of a public story when the documents stop being the center of attention. It happened here, quietly, incrementally, in the weeks and months following the initial reporting on Archewell's governance structure and filing history. The actual content of the documents began to recede. What replaced it was something harder to resolve and far more combustible. A debate about what the documents meant, and who had the authority to interpret them. Supporters of the Foundation argued, with some merit, that nonprofit governance structures vary widely, that 2-person boards are not illegal, and that Charity Watch's inability to rate an organization is not equivalent to a finding of wrongdoing. These are accurate statements. They are also statements that sidestep the core concern, which was never about legality. It was about transparency. Critics argued, also with some merit, that an organization publicly committed to the highest standards of institutional integrity ought to hold itself to governance standards above the legal minimum. That the gap between the Foundation's public-facing mission language and its internal oversight structure was itself a kind of information. These are also accurate statements. They are also statements that sometimes slid into territory that mixed documented facts with speculation. Watchdog groups stepped into this space. GuideStar, now called Candid, published the Foundation's filings as part of its standard database. Charity Watch published its assessment. The Better Business Bureau's Wise Giving Alliance has its own set of accountability standards for charitable organizations, 20 standards across governance, finances, and transparency, and the question of whether Archewell met all of them became a legitimate subject of nonprofit journalism. But in the broader media ecosystem, the story had already transformed. People weren't debating forms anymore. They were debating credibility. And credibility debates are governed by different rules than document debates. In a document debate, evidence is primary. In a credibility debate, identity is primary, who the person is, what you believe about them, whether the institution raising the question has standing to do so. The documents became props in a larger argument about trust, loyalty, and the politics of the British monarchy's relationship with a biracial American woman who had married into it and then left. That framing is not wrong. Context always matters. But it had a cost. As the credibility debate expanded, the specific numerical findings inside the 990 filings became harder to hold on to. The expense ratios, the grant-to-expense relationship, the board structure, these precise, documentable facts floated away into a fog of competing narratives. And in that fog, a specific concern hardened into a tribal signal. You either believed the filing told a story worth examining, or you believed examining it was itself an act of bad faith. People weren't debating forms anymore. They were debating credibility. And the next development would make that credibility question impossible to ignore. Here is a specific number. In the fiscal year covered by one of Archewell's publicly filed 990 forms, the foundation reported approximately $7.5 million in total expenses. In that same year, it reported approximately $1.8 million in grants paid out to recipient organizations. That means roughly 24 cents of every dollar the foundation spent actually reached external charitable causes. The remaining 76 cents covered operational costs. That ratio is not illegal. Many legitimate foundations operate at similar or lower grant-to-expense ratios during early years or periods of organizational growth. Infrastructure costs are real. Staff costs are real. Programming costs are real. But here is the context that matters. The foundation raised approximately $3.1 million in donations during the same period it spent $7.5 million. It spent more than double what it raised. And its liabilities increased by more than $600,000. These are numbers from the foundation's own filing. Not from a hostile source. Not from a tabloid. From a document signed and submitted to the United States Internal Revenue Service. When these figures were reported accurately in news coverage, the response split almost entirely along pre-existing loyalties. Supporters pointed to the complexities of early-stage nonprofit development. Critics pointed to the gap between the foundation's public profile and its internal financial picture. Neither camp was wrong about the facts. Both camps were operating on different assumptions about what the facts meant. This is where the modern media environment reveals its deepest structural problem. Most people do not read 990 filings. They read headlines, and headlines compress. A story that accurately summarizes a 990's expense ratio in one paragraph becomes, in the social media share cycle, a 6-word claim stripped of all context. Context requires time. Headlines require speed. The result is a public that is simultaneously overinformed and under-equipped to evaluate what it is being told. The documents showed something specific. The headlines showed something simpler. The gap between those two things became a space where every prior assumption about the people involved rushed in to fill the void. What emerged was not a debate about charitable governance. It was a referendum on Meghan Markle. And referendums are not settled by Form 990s. They are settled by power, by who controls the narrative, by which framing reaches the largest audience first and holds on longest. The compliance question, the actual question embedded in the actual documents, was not answered. It was absorbed, digested by a media ecosystem that processes accountability journalism and celebrity gossip in the same afternoon news cycle, at the same scroll speed with the same algorithmic weight. But the biggest surprise wasn't in the headlines. It was hiding inside public expectations, specifically, what the public expected an organization with this name and these founders to be. And that expectation had become its own kind of liability. There is a particular burden that attaches to celebrity philanthropy that has no equivalent in institutional giving. When a hospital foundation files a 990, almost nobody outside the nonprofit sector reads it. When a university endowment publishes its annual report, A small community of analysts evaluates it. These documents exist in professional ecosystems with established interpretive frameworks. When Meghan Markle's foundation files a 990, it is read by compliance experts, royal commentators, investigative journalists, opposition researchers, loyal supporters, and several million people who follow the story for reasons that have nothing to do with charitable governance. That is not Archewell's fault. It is a structural reality of celebrity philanthropy. But structural realities have consequences. The Archewell Foundation launched in 2020 with a stated mission to uplift and unite communities and to drive systemic cultural change. Those are ambitious words. They are also words that create a specific category of public expectation. One that is virtually impossible to satisfy on a 990 filing because number 990 filing can document systemic cultural change in a way that translates into a shareable headline. What 990 filings do document precisely and publicly are financial ratios, governance structures, and grant amounts. And on those specific, documentable metrics, the Archewell Foundation's filings raised questions that the Foundation's public communications did not answer. This is the core mechanism of the celebrity charity trap. An organization builds enormous public goodwill on the basis of its founder's identity and stated mission. That goodwill creates an implicit guarantee, a social contract between the organization and its donors, its supporters, and the public that attention is paid to. The guarantee is not legal. It is moral. And when documents emerge that appear to challenge it, the gap between the implicit promise and the documented reality becomes the story. The higher the trust, the harder the fall. Not because the fall is necessarily proportionate, but because expectation creates a distance that fact has to travel to close it. In Archewell's case, the gap between the public-facing narrative of impact and the documented financial structure of the organization was not enormous. But it was visible. And in the attention economy, visible gaps have an exponential effect on public confidence. A watchdog that cannot rate you is a signal. A board of 2 is a signal. A grant-to-expense ratio of 24 cents on the dollar is a signal. No single signal condemns, but signals accumulate. And accumulated signals, in the context of a public figure already operating inside an intensely polarized narrative, do not add up arithmetically. They compound. Fear is the correct word for what this section is about. Not fear of the foundation, fear of the mechanism. The mechanism by which an organization built on goodwill discovers that goodwill has a ceiling, and the ceiling is lower than anyone thought. The higher the trust, the harder the fall. And what came next would test both in ways the filing itself never could. If you're finding value in this breakdown, take a moment to like the video. It helps us continue producing evidence-based analysis rather than sensational headlines. Here is something that almost never gets named directly in conversations about institutional accountability. The most powerful investigation of any public figure or organization in the modern era is not conducted by the IRS. It is not conducted by the California Attorney General. It is not conducted by Charity Watch or the Better Business Bureau or any of the formal oversight bodies whose job it is to evaluate charitable organizations. It is conducted by the public. And the public conducts its investigation in real time, across platforms, without subpoena power or evidentiary standards, without rules of evidence or due process protections, without the burden of proof that formal legal proceedings require. The public's investigation of Archewell began the moment the foundation was announced and has never stopped. It operates in the comment sections of YouTube videos, in the quote-tweet threads of journalists, in the private group chats of royal watchers whose enthusiasm for the subject exceeds anything a professional analyst would call proportionate. This is not new. Every public institution that touches celebrity eventually becomes the subject of this kind of distributed scrutiny. The difference in Archewell's case is the volume and the velocity. Royal commentary channels on YouTube regularly produce videos with title cards featuring Meghan Markle's name in large block letters and accumulate millions of views within days. Social media accounts devoted to tracking Sussex-related news operate around the clock across multiple time zones. The story of Archewell's governance questions reached audiences that had never heard the term Form 990 through memes, thumbnail images, and 90-second clips that compressed months of compliance reporting into a single damning sentence. And those audiences did something that formal investigators cannot do. They felt something. Regulators produce reports. The public produces verdicts. This is both the power and the danger of distributed public investigation. It can surface real concerns that formal oversight misses. It can hold powerful institutions accountable in ways that regulatory timelines never allow. It can create reputational consequences proportionate to behavior that the law considers non-actionable. Can also be wrong. Can amplify incomplete information. Can be weaponized. It can be driven by prior grievance dressed up as principled concern. All of these things were true simultaneously in the public investigation of Archewell. The formal question, does this foundation meet nonprofit governance standards, remained technically open, not yet resolved by any regulatory finding. But the public question, do you trust this organization, had already been answered by millions of people in both directions with the force of absolute certainty. Regulators weren't the only ones asking questions. The public had started conducting its own investigation, and that investigation had a momentum that no corrected filing could reverse. Let me slow down here, because what follows is not about Archewell specifically. It is about something older and more fundamental than any single organization or any single couple. It is about trust, what it is made of, how it accumulates, and why, once the first visible crack appears, it travels in one direction only. Psychologists who study institutional trust use a term, asymmetric loss. The concept is straightforward. Trust is built through repeated positive experiences over time. It erodes through single negative experiences that are salient, visible, and tied to expectations that were already high. In other words, 10 years of doing good work does not protect an organization from 1 year of visible governance failure. The math is not linear. The brain does not calculate trust the way an accountant calculates a balance sheet. This is not new knowledge. It is not even controversial. The Roman historian Livy documented the moment the Roman Senate lost the confidence of its citizens, not in the year of its greatest corruption, but in the year a specific, visible betrayal made the abstract corruption real to ordinary people. The British public did not lose faith in parliamentary institutions across decades of policy disagreement. It lost faith in a specific moment, during a specific scandal, when a specific gap between stated values and documented behavior became impossible to deny. The mechanism is always the same. Trust is fragile not because institutions are fragile. They are often resilient. Trust is fragile because human beings evaluate institutions through pattern recognition, not actuarial tables. And the pattern that registers most powerfully is not the pattern of steady, quiet competence. It is the pattern of promised integrity meeting documented shortfall. For Archewell, the pattern that registered was specific. An organization founded on the premise of transparency, by founders who had left the British royal family partly on the grounds that the institution was insufficiently honest, had structured its own governance in a way that an independent watchdog declared inadequate for external evaluation. That is not a scandal, strictly speaking. It is an irony. But irony in institutions does what scandals do in politics. Crystallizes. It gives the abstract a concrete form. And it gives the public a story that is both easy to understand and difficult to unsee. Trust is fragile. And the next development would test it even further. Because just as the governance conversation was reaching saturation, just as the public debate was beginning to settle into its established camps, a development emerged that reframed the entire question. Not in a courtroom, not in a regulatory office, in a conversation about what celebrity philanthropy is actually for. And that conversation struck at something more uncomfortable than any filing. The assumption that public goodwill and institutional accountability are naturally aligned. They are not. And the story of Archewell is, in part, the story of what happens when they diverge. This wasn't only about Archewell anymore. By the time the governance conversation had run its course in the royal commentary space, a parallel conversation was quietly beginning in nonprofit journalism. A smaller, less watched, less emotionally charged conversation that was in many ways more important. It was a conversation about the structural challenges facing celebrity foundations as an institutional category. Consider the landscape. The Gates Foundation, despite its enormous size and complexity, operates with a board that includes multiple independent members, and has undergone significant governance restructuring over time precisely because the scrutiny of its size demanded it. The Clinton Foundation faced significant public questions about donor relationships that, whatever one's political position, led to measurable changes in the organization's governance disclosures. The Oprah Winfrey Foundation and the Ellen DeGeneres Charitable Foundation both operate under governance structures that independent evaluators can assess through standard watchdog criteria. None of these comparisons is perfect. None is intended to suggest equivalence. They are intended to illustrate a pattern that nonprofit governance experts have named in professional literature for years. Celebrity foundations face a specific accountability problem that most of their founders never anticipated when they created them. The problem is this: celebrity brings resources. Celebrity brings attention. Celebrity brings donor access that most nonprofits spend decades trying to cultivate. But celebrity also brings something else. It brings the assumption that the founder's personal integrity is a sufficient substitute for institutional governance. That because the person standing at the gala is admirable, the organization they have attached their name to is automatically trustworthy. This assumption is not unique to celebrity founders. It is a known failure mode in philanthropic institutions of all sizes. But it becomes most visible and most damaging when the founder's public profile is so large that the institution effectively becomes invisible behind it. No one sees Archewell. They see Harry and Meghan. And when questions arise, those questions do not land on the institution. They land on the people. The governance reforms that might actually address the documented concerns: an expanded, independent board, a formal expense ratio target, a transparent grant-making process. These are institutional solutions. They require the organization to become more visible as an institution and to make its founders somewhat less central to its identity. That is a structural shift that many celebrity foundations resist, not out of bad faith, but because the entire commercial logic of their existence depends on the founder's name remaining the primary asset. This wasn't only about Archewell anymore. It had become a debate about modern philanthropy itself, about whether the celebrity foundation model, in which personal reputation substitutes for institutional infrastructure, is capable of meeting the governance standards the sector's own watchdogs have established, and about who bears the cost when it fails. The answer to that question is never the celebrity. It is always the cause. Let me slow down completely here, because after months of debate, after the headline cycle ran its course, after the social media verdict was delivered and delivered again, after the compliance experts published their assessments and the royal commentators published theirs, the actual answer to the actual question has been sitting in a public document the entire time. What does the Archewell Foundation's IRS filing actually reveal? Not fraud. The filing does not reveal fraud. No regulatory body has issued a finding of fraud. No investigation has concluded that charitable funds were stolen or misdirected to private benefit. Any claim to that effect is not supported by the documented record. What the filing reveals is a governance structure that fell below the independently established standards for a charitable organization of Archewell's public profile and donor base. 2 board members, founders, married to each other. No independent majority. What the filing reveals is a financial picture in which expenses significantly exceeded revenue in a given year. Grant payouts represented a small fraction of total expenditure, and liabilities increased. What the filing reveals is that an independent watchdog applying standard sector criteria was unable to rate the organization, not because something was hidden, but because the structural prerequisites for evaluation were absent. These are not the elements of a scandal. They are the elements of a cautionary story about institutional design. The Archewell Foundation did not collapse into scandal because it was corrupt. It entered a period of sustained public scrutiny because the gap between its stated values and its documented governance structure gave scrutiny a foothold. And in the modern media environment, a foothold is all scrutiny needs. Here is what I believe the filing actually reveals, and I want to be precise about this because precision is what this format demands. The filing reveals that an organization founded by 2 of the most recognizable people on the planet, positioned as a vehicle for systemic change, operating in an era of unprecedented public accountability for charitable institutions, was structured in a way that made it impossible for independent evaluators to verify whether it was meeting the standards it had publicly committed to. That is not a crime. It is not a conspiracy. It is a miscalculation. And the nature of that miscalculation tells you something important. Not about Meghan Markle's character or Prince Harry's intentions, but about the specific, recurring error that celebrity philanthropy makes when it allows the founder's identity to substitute for institutional infrastructure. After months of debate, the answer was both simpler and more complicated than anyone expected. Simpler, the filing revealed a governance gap that an organization of this profile should have closed. More complicated, closing that gap would require the organization to become something its entire commercial logic makes difficult. An institution, rather than an extension of two very famous people. And that tension has never been resolved. Here is where every accountability story eventually arrives. Not at the answer, at the question that the evidence has produced but cannot resolve. The question in this case is not about Archewell's filing history. That history is documented. The question is not about the governance structure. That structure has been assessed. The question is not even about the expense ratios or the grant figures. Those numbers are in the public record. The question that still hasn't been answered, the one that sits at the center of this story regardless of which way you interpret everything that surrounds it, is this: what is the Archewell Foundation actually for? Not rhetorically, not in the mission statement language of uplifting and uniting communities. In the structural, operational, institutional sense that the sector's own standards demand. Is it a grant-making organization? If so, why does its grant-to-expense ratio fall so far below sector norms for organizations at its scale of public visibility? Is it a programmatic organization, one that delivers services directly rather than through grants? If so, where is the independent evaluation of those programs? Where is the outcome data that any serious programmatic foundation would be required to produce to maintain the confidence of institutional donors? Is it a platform, a vehicle for the founder's public engagement and advocacy rather than a traditional charitable institution? If so, does the governance structure appropriate for a platform differ from the governance structure appropriate for a foundation? And does the public, when it donates to a platform wearing the name of a foundation, understand the difference? These questions do not have hostile intent. They are the questions that nonprofit governance experts ask of every organization attempting to operate at Archewell's level of public visibility and donor engagement. They are also questions the foundation has not answered in its public communications with the specificity that the documented concerns warrant. Power structure storytelling is not ultimately about exposing bad actors. The most important stories in this format are about the gap between institutions and the expectations that sustain them, between the language institutions use to describe themselves and the documents that describe what they actually do. The most powerful institutions in any society are not tested when everything is working. They are tested when questions begin. Governments are tested by constitutional crises. Police departments are tested by documented misconduct. Media institutions are tested by reporting failures. And charitable foundations are tested when their governance structures, their financial figures, and their public commitments are placed in the same frame and evaluated together. The Archewell Foundation has been in that frame for years now. And its response to that scrutiny, characterized largely by public silence on the specific governance questions, a rebranding to Archewell Philanthropies, a transition to a fiscal sponsorship model, and a series of public-facing activities that maintain the founder's profile without addressing the underlying structural concerns, has not closed the question. Trust takes years to build and moments to damage. That is not a moral indictment. It is a description of how institutional credibility works in an age where every document is a potential headline and every governance gap is a potential story. The Archewell Foundation may evolve. It may restructure. It may eventually produce the independent board, the transparent grant-making process, and the outcome documentation that would allow watchdogs to evaluate it on the sector's own terms. Or it may continue as it is, dependent on the founder's personal profile for its credibility, structurally resistant to the independent oversight that would make it genuinely verifiable, and perpetually vulnerable to the scrutiny that its own governance decisions invite. Either path is a choice, and choices, in institutions as in individuals, reveal something about priorities. Because the most important investigation may not be happening inside any government agency. It may be happening inside public opinion, and that investigation never really closes. Subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful power structure storytelling that focuses on evidence, accountability, and the systems shaping public life. And tell me in the comments, when public trust and public relations collide, which one usually wins?